Chris, how many years did you spend in the BBC?
41.
That's good for your pension.
Yeah.
So when did you join?
Joined in 65. I went actually to All Saints Green in Norwich, BBC Norwich, for an interview, and they said, "Where would you like to work?" And I said, "In London." I then received a very quick reply saying, "Your starting date is the 31st of May, and you will be at Brentford Film Vaults."
Oh, right.
So I started as a clerk there, did 2 years there, and then went to film examination at Ealing Film Studios. And then I wanted to get into town, so I dipped back down to clerk again, but it was for Telecine at Television Centre, and it was very, very busy, obviously, because so much more came off Telecine then than did VT.
Of course. And you were recording tele-recordings, presumably.
Of course, yeah.
Why did you go to Norwich for the interview?
Because my parents, when I was 2, I went up to Norfolk and took my parents with me, of course. And,
That's good of you.
Yes. And no, my parents started a business up there. My mother was an Irish, very devout Catholic Irish nurse who wanted me to be either the Pope or the Queen's physician because we were near the Sandringham estate and couldn't understand why I either wanted to play in goal for England or be a rock star. So I came down, as you did, hitchhiked down with a friend to work in London. I worked at what was the first Little Chef, which was a very stylish restaurant in the middle of Regent's Park, and it was built in answer to Forte's at the Serpentine, but it was a Little Chef. Anyway, and then I went back, worked for my father and mother.
You presumably saw an advertisement when you were in Norwich then?
No, I kept applying without seeing advertisements. I kept applying, saying that I sent about 12 letters saying that I was God's answer to the BBC. And then got a letter of, thank you, we will keep you on file and so on. And then when I wrote in 13th time or something like that, I said I'll do anything. and got an interview. But it was at All Saints Green in Norwich.
Oh, I see.
BBC, Norwich. And then...
So you went to Brentford?
Went to Brentford.
Before the football stadium?
Well, no, the football stadium was there. Brentford...
not the new one?
No, not the new one, of course. No. Did you know that
Very run down in those days, wasn't it?
Brentford? It was a very old ground. It had a pub on each corner, which was quite famous. When you think Jimmy Hill played for them, Rod Stewart played for them, Billy Cotton Senior, Wakey played for them.
Did he?
But they were First Division side just after the war.
Yes.
Very big.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here you're in Brentford, working at the film library in the vaults.
Yes. Cataloguing, acquisitions. We used to get in these, the Virginian and, what was the other big cowboy of the time? The Virginian.
High Chaparral?
High Chaparral, certainly. And they used to come in 35mm cans that were 3,000 foot, and they were very heavy.
Yeah.
But the quality was absolutely brilliant. It was
that was the only way of showing American material, really, wasn't it, in those days? Telecine.
Yes, it used to receive in like all cinemas received in American films, on the reels. And
yes, I think people don't really understand the whole question of NTSC and PAL and so on, how the video thing was very different from film. So, so you were moving a lot of film around and also presumably shipping it out to various places.
Yes, it was every hour. There was a van arrived with bringing old stock back and then taking out the new. Change around on the hour. And the first one in the morning would be full, of course, from Telecine the night before.
Did you get any experience with production, any exposure to production in those early days?
I did, because there was a gentleman who I worked with called Paul Slatter. He was a great keyboard player. I was playing then drums and rhythm guitar. And he was a keyboard player. and he had a band from Slough called The System, and he wanted to film them. So I didn't know much about the techniques of camera work or whatever, but I knew about film, of what it was and so on. So, and I fancied myself as a great film director anyway. So, so I said that I would direct it for them, and he paid for the camera and so on and so forth. There was another guy called Jeremy who wanted to be a cameraman, so he was the cameraman. And we went out and we filmed them doing a show, and during the day and packing up, and called it How the System Worked. It was awful. It was absolutely dreadful. But in those days we were very proud of ourselves.
Quite.
Because we'd got the sound right.
Ah, yes. Well, that's always more important, really.
Well, indeed, indeed. Although we used to tell people that came into BBC Sport from radio that we had pictures without sound.
Okay, so but this was before you got involved in sport in the BBC, but you were moving sports material around, presumably.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, well, Match of the Day was tele-recordings initially, and they would have to be acquisitioned and put in a different part of the library, as did nitrate film because of being flammable and so on. So that went into another place.
Okay, did you get out to Lime Grove and other places like that, or were you stuck at Brentford?
No, the first time I was in Lime Grove was as a sports floor manager in '72. But I used to go to Television Centre, to the club there, and this was Television Centre, and
you'd wander around the studios, presumably,
phoning mum and dad and saying I'm in Television Centre. Yeah, it was brilliant. So the Buzz, we used to go as kids. Then you'd just go and visit and have a drink in the club, and
the club was extraordinary in those days.
It was indeed. It was indeed.
And you'd find people in fancy dress. Well, actors who were having a little tipple before their recording.
If I can go off just for a second, my best man was a guy called Warren Clark, who was Dalia Lampasco. I don't know if you remember. Warren died sadly about 6 years ago. But he was my best man, and he was playing a part. The makeup took about 5 hours. Now I can't remember what the play was, but he was just covered in hair, head to foot, a la a gorilla or whatever. And we used to have great fun. And I was working as floor manager on Sports Night then, and he was recording the same night. And he said, "Take me up to the club holding my hand, and I'll do the squat." And he thought this was very, very funny, and he was doing the waddle and the walk. And I just walked past Eric, who was the doorman in those days, and used to have a microphone through and used to page people in the club. They used to play dreadful games on him, like they phoned up and wanted Keith Moon from The Who on top of the Pops night. And he was going to put out the page. And somebody pointed him out in the sidebar, and he went over and he said, Eric said to him, "Excuse me, sir, are you Mr. Keith Moon of the Who group?" And to which he answered, "No, I'm fucking Andy Pandy." And Eric said, "In that case, it's time to go home." Brilliant. Oh, and the cast of the Wooden Tops, would they please come to reception? They used to. Anyway, I digress.
Okay.
And I took Warren in.
Yeah.
And he was very proud of this makeup and so on.
Yeah. And
we waddled up to the bar, and the steward came over and said, "Chris, what would you like?" And so I said, and he turned and he said, "What would you like, Warren?" And his world collapsed. He thought he was totally unrecognisable. The makeup was so good and so on. But yes, it was an extraordinary place, the BBC Club.
So what happened then? You presumably wanted to move into studio work or OB work?
Initially, I was living in Shepherd's Bush, and I wanted to move into Kew. So unbeknown to me, I moved in just down the road from where we are now, where you live, David.
Yeah.
There was a gentleman across the road who has done one of these, David Collison, who lived opposite. And I was sitting at the first floor flat and looking out the window, but I was practicing drums with pads and so on, so it was quiet. But this was about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and I looked across the road, and there was a gentleman in stripes with a torch and something else in his hand, creeping round the front garden and going round to the back and dipping up and down. So I, being the good neighbour, but this is before Neighbourhood Watch, of course, I phoned up the police, who came round and picked me up and said, right, so you stand back, we will handle this, but I'll need some identification. And they knocked on the door, and David came to the door in his pyjamas, and I said, that's him. And then it struck me, why would he wear pyjamas if it wasn't his house? Anyway.
Well, David claims he was looking for slugs, which probably explains it.
As a result, David wasn't arrested. David and I became excellent friends. And he introduced me to a gentleman called Ronnie Pantlin, who was BBC as a page boy in 1936 to 1939, where he joined the RAF and eventually did 5 years as a rear gunner. Now, as any rear gunner, if there are any left or listening, to survive 5 years on Gloucesters and Lancasters and so on as a rear gunner, which was the main point for the fighter to make, get rid of the rear gunner, and you had free range. And Ronnie survived 5 years and lived as if he'd survived 5 years, but one of the great characters, senior stage manager. And of course, like all heroes, he didn't talk about the war very much. But he was shot down twice, and an amazing character. But the BBC then, outside broadcast in 45, 46, were employing probably for not just the self-discipline, but probably for the talkback discipline, were employing a lot of ex-Air Force people. And we in the department, in the BBC outside broadcast, at that time had a number of them. Dennis Munger, Alan Shivers, a lot that became big in BBC Sport, but were in the RAF as pilots and so on.
Being a stage manager, as they were known, well, floor manager in studios, of course, meant looking after everything really, organising things. So you went straight into that. Did you get any training for it?
Well, yes. I mean, David introduced me to Ronnie because he thought I would be a good candidate, and that was in '68. Ronnie took me on board for a training attachment. I did the training attachment, and then because it was, as they call it, dead men's shoes, there were no vacancies. And up to '72 there was a vacancy, and I applied for that, having done holiday reliefs.
What were you having to do? I mean, even as a trainee, you were on location. This was at football matches, but it could be anything.
Oh, anything. You were the eyes and ears of the producer outside the scanner. So you looked after commentators. You got John Motts and his Mars bar and took in all his complaints, and you could do anything. But because I came from a sort of light entertainment background, I was writing music. I played in bands. I wanted to do that. I wanted to do everything. So I did. I did sport, I did events, and I did light entertainment. I did, when Old Grey Whistle Test went on the road, I was their Strand stage manager. So it was looking after artists, it was queuing, it was doing warm-ups for the audience, it was, and general dog's body.
So you had to have patter, did you?
You had to have a bit of patter, yes. But Ronnie then, I did the board, and Slim Wilkinson, who was assistant head of sport then to Brian Calgill, who was a famous name.
Very much so.
And an ogre. He
controller BBC One, wasn't he?
Controller BBC One, yes. He got, was it Dallas he got in? Anyway, he he was his deputy, and he called me in only about an hour after the board, and he said, "You haven't got it."
Yeah.
And I went, after 4 years, "I haven't got it." And he said, "No." He said, "You've got floor manager sport in the studio," which was the last thing I wanted, but you know, I went. Okay. I wanted to be out on the road. So, if I may just tell a quick story about Ronnie Pantlin, who was one of the great characters. Robin Day, for instance, would do nothing without him in the studio. David Attenborough knew him well, and from the Silbury Dig. And anyway, he was, because he was senior stage manager, he had to look after and go round with the Duke of Norfolk, the Queen's stage manager, to all the royal events, pre-coverage, BBC coverage, to make sure everything was in order and what they were planning and what they needed from us and how we had to comply and so on and so forth. It was the stage opening of Parliament, and they were walking up the steps of the South Hall. There was a camera cable across the steps. He said, "Ronald," he said, "what is that, pray?" And Ronnie said, "There's a camera cable, sir. I'll put a DFA on that." And he said, "What, pray, Ronald, is a DFA?" And he said, "Well, begging your pardon, sir, it's a different fucking arrangement." Now, sometime after that, they were doing the Royal Ascot, and Ronnie was walking round, and the Duke of Norfolk was looking for things that were amiss, so they could point them out and say, "Put a DFA on that, Ronnie," and then burst into laughter. So anyway, yes, and then I went and joined Grandstand Match of the Day and Sports Night.
That was your element, really, presumably.
To a certain extent, sport was, because I'd been an apprentice footballer. I'd had a trial at Norwich when I was 15. So it was sport I loved, music I loved. So I had that mixture, you know.
You did music OBs, presumably, as well,
I did, with Dr. Brian Large, a wonderful man. Just a really nice human being, and a great director and producer. So he liked me on his classical stuff.
Yeah.
With Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, we were doing E Domineo at the London Opera House, which was somewhere getting towards the East End. Anyway, we were doing this, and Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears had a falling out. Benjamin Britten went to his dressing room and stayed there, and there was an audience and so on, and I was ordered to go and inform him that we were, on the clock.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that I went over the top a bit. I got angry, if you like, because of his...
he was being truculent, was he?
Truculent was a well-selected word. He was. And acting basically like a spoiled child. And I explained to him that the audience was waiting. We were on the clock. We had to finish recording and so on. Anyway, eventually he came out. But yes, Brian Large was chuckling in the background. Yeah, so we did that, and I was writing music in '72 when my first day was the Cup final, 1972 Cup final, and I was at the same time as that involved with a gentleman called Alan Benson, who was in music department at Kensington House. Wonderful man, became a producer and produced Melvin Bragg for a long time. Great pianist. And we wrote 11 pieces of title music for BBC. But the World Cup theme in '74, Striker bought me my first car. So and one is still getting PRS payments, which is the theme for Pro Celebrity Golf.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which... so, yes, it's... and then it started, and then I was off 2 months later to Munich, the Olympics.
Okay.
And suddenly, it all became, this is what it's all about.
Tell us about Olympics, because they are a mixed blessing, I suspect.
Indeed they are. Munich...
that was a terrible one because of the disaster.
Was terrible. It was terrible.
So tell us about that.
To start with, we thought this was going to be the greatest Olympics of all time because of the organisational art that the Germans had, and so on and so forth, and how everything was done to the letter. And then the disaster happened. Terrorists arrived. There were 8 of them, and they knocked on the door. This was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, Strasse, which was where they were, we could see from the roof of our studio, the IBC, which was then an extension of the village, and we could see that balcony, and there's famous shots. Ricky Tilling, I think, engineered, put a camera up on the roof, and we were filming the balcony, and that famous shot of the balaclava, the hooded balaclava man looking over the balcony, was from BBC stock.
Right.
But 6 o'clock in the morning, they knocked on the door of the weightlifters, and the coach, I think it was Moshe Weinberg, slammed the door, and they sprayed the gun through the door, and he was apparently almost cut in half, and that was how it started.
Then it became a siege, I think, did it?
It became a siege.
Yes.
And total siege. And that's the thing brought down the government, basically, was that they'd got it so dreadfully wrong when the negotiations went on and on and on, and they got what they wanted to go to the airport. They wanted the helicopters there,
yes,
and so on and so forth. But for some reason, they were told that there were only 5 of them, and in fact there were 8. So they had 5 sharpshooters, and that's where it all started to go wrong. Because as soon as one was being shot, the others had notice, and they were in the helicopters and taking with the hostages and just taking grenades and dropping them on the floor, and boom. And that was it, I think.
So it became a huge news story, as well as a disaster for the Olympics.
Indeed.
So how did that change what you were doing? Because
totally, Brian Cowgill was the boss, but Support Fox came out to sort of police the whole of the Olympics before the terrorist thing, anyway. And News phoned up apparently and said, "We'll take over," and Sir Paul said, "We are News, we'll cover it." So David Coleman and I sat in the studio for getting on for 30 hours, and he was doing report by report. And we were taking a little pill to keep us awake and so on and so forth. But it was, it was a bad one. It was a really bad one.
How long did it all last?
It lasted a couple of days, and there again we were told by the German police, the German authorities, whatever, that they had been successfully arrested at the airport. Everything was fine, that the terrorists, that the hostages were safe. And how that got out, I don't know. But Brian Cowgill said, "Right, we can go back to the hotel, back to the bar," and which we did, and we were elated. But then at 5 o'clock in the morning, I got a telephone call saying we're going back into work. It's not all over; they're all dead. And I think one survived, didn't he? There was one of them, I think.
Was this Baader Meinhof?
Yes. Yeah, the Palestinian. And anyway, that was that. The games finished, and we came home. But obviously, it all.
So did the games go on to an
extent? They went on. Yes,
they did go on.
They did. Amazingly, because in Atlanta, which was one of the worst in '96, one of the worst Olympics of all time, a much smaller, a firework basically went off in the park, and both the FBI and the CIA wanted to cancel the games, and so on, and American reaction. Yes, so the games went on, and we all came home, but it will be forever remembered for that.
Yes, of course.
Very sad.
Okay. So you did other Olympics in between those two, did you?
Oh yes, I did.
So-
In
So
fact,
there were some Olympics which were actually enjoyable.
yes. Oh, indeed they were. I mean, I was involved. I've been involved in 12 Olympic Games.
12. So
the-
Atlanta and Moscow are the ones you probably remember as being unpleasant.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, 80. Things got much better after 80, but 80 was unbelievable.
That was Atlanta.
No, sorry, that was Moscow.
Oh, that was Moscow.
1980. Margaret Thatcher didn't want to go. The Russians didn't want us there. The Americans pulled out, but they had a team of about 10 there. But it allowed us access, NBC, it allowed us access to their Coke machine, which was probably one of the only things that was acceptable. It was a bad Olympics. We were forced to have two KGB gentlemen with us, and one of them was called Valery. He spoke English with a plum, and was very. It was clipped and perfect English, and the accent was perfect. I said, "Where did you go in England? Where did you learn English?" "We're in the UK," and he said, "I haven't been out of Moscow, Chris. Moscow University taught me." So I thought, well, that's strange. And then one day, one of the only palatable things was the hotel, Cosmos Hotel, which is still there. I was there about 2 years ago, and I went to look at it. It's still there anyway. There was a nightclub down, if you can call it a nightclub, down below, and we used to gather there every night and have lime vodka and not eat very much. And as a result, Henry Cooper came back ill. Ron Pickering lost about 7 stone and had kidney trouble.
Because the food was so dreadful.
Yes, and it took so long to get it. And I walked down the corridor of IBC the next day, and Valerie's coming towards me.
That's the International Broadcasting
Centre.
Centre,
Yes,
yeah.
indeed. Please don't.
No,
yes,
that's right.
And he was walking down the corridor, and I was feeling dreadful. And he said, "Good morning, Chris. How are you today?" And I said, "Hanging in rags, Valerie." And as we got level, he just walked past, and he said, "Join the club." And it just made me. You didn't learn English like that at the University of Moscow, you know.
No,
So
interesting. Yes.
and we were followed everywhere. I mean, I decided, we were told we had to go, and it was about, well, it looked a lot closer than it was because it was a tower where the IBC was from the Cosmos, but from my room you could see straight up the main avenue to the IBC. And it was a glorious morning, and there was a beautiful park on the right, and although we were told we had to go by bus, you know, just for a short ride, I thought, I'm going to walk through the park. So I did. I just walked out the gate and across the road to the park, and walked on, and as I got to the IBC, a gentleman came up to me in a grey suit. They were all grey suits. And he said, "Good morning, Mr. Lewis. Did you enjoy your walk through our park?" You know, and just everything was, you know, there was...
Everything was monitored. Yeah,
monitored.
Sure.
And I received one letter that was posted on the day after I left. I got it 2 days before I left. It was after nearly 5 weeks, and it had been opened. And, you know, it was just, you felt pressure.
Yes.
And the British Airways, Alec Weeks, who was the executive producer, had to charter a BA aircraft to get there and back. When they said, when the captain came on, when they actually said, "We've left Russian airspace," the aircraft shook. Everybody was so relieved to get out of there.
Really interesting. It was an appalling experience. But did it affect the broadcasts? Do you think the fact that people were so
well? It was
fed
funny.
up?
Yes, it did, because in fact I've got first-hand experience of it. Martin Hopkins, there was NBC wanted a report from us, just a 30-seconder. We had a landline in those days where we could get out of the Russian, we could broadcast direct, And there had been, during the javelin, a situation where, when the Russian was throwing, the main doors were behind him, and these doors opened, so helping wind assist. And when he'd finished, the doors closed. Anyway, Martin Hopkins allowed me to direct. It was one camera, and it was Frank Boff, and and I knew Frank well, and so I wasn't doing anything, but it meant that Martin, who had been working hard all day, didn't have to extend his day, so they let me through and just do this quick report for the States. And Valerie stood behind me, and Frank had put this, quite rightly, into his report. Carefully worded, but it still suggested what was happening. And the feed went.
Just went.
And I turned round and I said, Valerie, what's going on? And he came up behind me, and he had the script in front of him. He said, I think the feed may get better, Chris, if you lost these 2 lines. So the 2 lines were lost.
Yes. Do you remember what the 2 lines were?
Well, it was not exactly, but it was intimating that the doors were being opened behind the javelin thrower.
The javelin, yes.
And it was giving him wind assist, and they were being closed for every other competitor.
Right.
So, indeed.
Dear, oh dear.
The way they work.
Yeah.
But
right.
yes.
And then you said Atlanta was another one, and that was the worst ever. Why was that?
They were awarded the Olympic Games, the Centennial Olympic Games, remember. So where was the natural place for the Centennial Olympics to go to? Greece. Greece couldn't afford it, but they should have got it, and it should have been made possible to have it. But, without litigation, we all know about Blatter, and we know about there was corruption, and this also was in the IOC. And the reason that Atlanta got it was CNN and Coca-Cola, 2 headquarters in the Atlanta.
Yes.
Now the disaster, the first day of the tennis, for instance, was at a place called Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain was the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. That's another story. But the first day, the written press were going up by coach to start their work, the first round of the tennis, and the woman driver of the coach stopped on the entrance to the freeway and wouldn't go any further. So they said, what's going on? And she'd never driven on a freeway before. And that was what the organisation was like across the board.
Oh.
It was just not.
And that went on being the case.
Yes, it was just, and of course we didn't do particularly well, so that also affects. But it was just badly organised. They shouldn't have got it, and there had been so many great ones before it. That was 96. 92 Barcelona was extraordinary. It was terrific. Executive producer was Martin Hopkins, of course.
Yes.
And
were you directing properly by then?
No, I was. I always have a laugh with Martin about this. He selected what he decided was going to be the fast response unit, and I would be producer of the fast response unit. Now, this fast response unit had an aerial that took 15 minutes to get up. So
wasn't that fast?
It wasn't that fast. It was a slow response unit.
Yes.
But we did some good work. So I was travelling around to various of the sites and locations, and yes, and it was a great Olympic Games, and then of course followed by Atlanta.
Yes, right, okay. Now, when you come to the period after Atlanta, you were still in sport. You stayed in sport till you retired, did you?
I did.
So what kinds of things were you producing and directing, presumably?
Match of the Day, in particular, racing, tennis, Wimbledon, Davis Cup, and boxing. I was a boxing producer. So those 4 sports were what I was doing. But we also covered general elections.
Tell me, I directed programs largely in studios, but also OBs and things like that. With scripts, yellow scripts all marked up and all that sort of thing. Yep. Most of it was, and there was the occasional as directed piece. But I mean, if you're directing sport, it's all as directed, but presumably to a formula. So, tell me about going live with a sports broadcast.
Yes, you're right. It's as directed, and
so you didn't have a vision mixer. You did your own vision mixer.
We did our own.
Right.
Later years, they introduced vision mixers, but those of us that had cut our own pictures poo-pooed that.
But I mean, camera operators would, in football or something. I mean, you didn't have to direct them; they knew what to do. Presumably.
Indeed, it depended on what unit you had. To a certain extent, you called the shots. But they all had a specific job. I mean, camera one on football, for instance, the ball has to be in his shot the whole time.
Oh, right.
Simple.
Fair enough. So
but not simple.
Safety shot.
Safety shot, yes. It should never go out of his shot.
No.
Even when it goes into the crowd. Right. Camera 2 is close-ups. Camera 3 down on the... For my formation, other producers had different ideas. I had camera 3 down low, and then 4 and 5 behind, and then isolated down below, a super slow-mo opposite, and super slow did the same job as camera 2, basically keeping everything, keeping the ball tighter in shot.
Tell us about this, because if you have a pause and you want to play something that's just happened, how is that done?
Through VT, you have.
Yes, but I mean, how do the VT people know where to go?
Because as a producer director, you said, I'll
use that.
Yeah, I'll use that VT.
Yeah.
And a lot of the operators were very quick and very, and then if you had number one game, you had an assistant producer who was in VT, so they knew exactly what they were doing. When you walk down the steps of the scanner, having directed a football match, the adrenaline was still pumping.
Yeah.
And
no, it's a great experience directing OBs, I think.
Indeed.
Particularly live ones. Yeah, absolutely.
And the first beer had a great effect.
Yes, quite.
But there were lovely stories from those days. Kenny Dalglish, for instance, he was manager of Blackburn when they, of course, won the Premiership with Shearer and Sutton and that team, and he was a character, Kenny. And because of the situation at Blackburn, we had to have the camera 3 on wheels on a trolley, so that we could wheel it back to cover the game and go forward for the pre-match. And I'm with Kenny down at this camera. It's at the tunnel, and I said to him, Kenny, can I move the camera forward so that I can see both corners? And yes, and he said, no, he said, because their manager won't be able to see through him, and I won't, in my dugout, won't be able to see through him. And so I said, okay. Anyway, I was walking away. He said, by the way, is Jockey Hansen in the studio tonight? And I said, yes, he is. So he said, I'm playing golf with him tomorrow. Can he bring a tape of the Newcastle game, because we're playing them next? And so I said, yeah, I'm sure. I'll give a quick ring, and can we talk more about camera 3? And he said, put it where you fucking like. Simple as that.
Yes.
So there were games. But
absolutely. What about the presenters? How were, Boff and co? How much preparation did you have to do with them?
Not a lot. They did a lot of their own preparation, obviously, their own research. I mean, people like Des Lynam and Frank Boff were supreme presenters, and they worked hard. They'd been, I think, actually, Frank had been in insurance at some stage, but he was doing work up north and Brian Cowgill saw him doing a regional thing and invited him down, and
I see. Yeah.
and he said, Frank, I want you to present Grandstand. And so Frank said, well, how many? And he said, approximately 67.
Approximately.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
Frank, yeah, they did mainly their own research and worked hard. And, you know, these are the glory days of BBC,
Yeah, of
BBC
course.
Sport, when
Yeah.
we had, you know, everything.
You had the gigs, and presumably you would cover cricket as well, which
Indeed.
became less popular.
Indeed.
Yeah. So the cricket commentators, you didn't use the radio commentators, presumably, or did you?
No, we didn't. No.
Had
We
your own.
We had John Arlott, Ted Dexter,
So you'd always have a separate group of presenters for
Jim Laker.
for the television.
Yeah,
You wouldn't touch-
basically, yes. Yeah, it totally different from radio, which then didn't become the case later on.
No.
But, you know, I was sitting as a stage manager, jumping back in the 81 Headingley Botham test. And I'd driven up to Headingley to the hotel. And I was sitting beside Jim Laker, and that was in the days when the Sunday was off and you started again on the Tuesday and Wednesday. And England were losing dreadfully on the Saturday evening. Anyway, Corals came in, the girl from Corals, and said, England to win 500 to 1. And I turned to Ted and I said, that's got to be worth a quid, Ted. And he said, only you've got a quid to throw away, dear boy. Anyway, and then he said, do you want to lift back to London? I said, well, I've got my car, but I was going to stay because it's just... And he said, well, I've got my plane. He said, no. So anyway, he gave me a lift back down, picked me up Monday morning, and then both of them did his work. And I didn't talk much to Ted after that.
Yes, quite. Now, you always think that the commentators who are getting the maximum number of words out are racing commentators. Is that true? Horse racing?
For horse racing? Yes, I mean, we're talking about one of the greats, Peter O'Sullivan.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean...
Just as you get to the end of a horse race, the commentary is about as fast as you can get it.
Yes, well, indeed, and the 100 metres with David Coleman.
True.
Who split it into three, and was brilliant. And the identification thereof. And there was nobody in racing, nobody better than Peter O'Sullivan. Jim McGrath, who followed him, was brilliant. But Peter was just you know...
When you say David Coleman split it into three, do you mean that the 100 metres was... He had three parts to his commentary?
He had the off, the middle, and the finish. So there was a pause between the middle, albeit, you know,
haven't got very much time.
We're talking about 10 seconds here,
right.
indeed.
Yes.
And the finish, but it gave him enough time to give the 1, 2, 3 and identify them superbly.
Yeah.
He was a supreme broadcaster, David Coleman.
Yeah.
Could be difficult, but was always right. Another find by Paul Fox,
Paul Fox,
who was another stanchion, wonderful man. He and Brian Cowgill, Ronnie Noble, and Paul Fox, as he was then, they were the ones who founded Grandstand, and the first Grandstand was October the 11th, 1958. And they moved on and up from then and from there, and just turned BBC Sport into the best in the world.
Until it started losing all its opportunities because of the commercial opposition, I suppose, and everything.
That's fair.
Everything going to Sky and what have you. Did that happen before you left? I mean, was it?
Oh yes,
it really was. It so it must have felt very bad.
Well, you know, we shared matches, so some of the BBC, the BBC covered on Saturday were live on Sky, and then Sky matches would just send a producer and a commentator to cover. They all went into television centre anyway. obviously commercialisation of the skies and others of this, well, lately BT and so on, of this world had a great effect on BBC contracts, but it wasn't helped, with all due respect to people like John Burt.
No.
And Producer's Choice, which was an absolute disaster. And he was a disaster for sport. And
really? That's interesting.
He just wasn't interested.
He just wasn't interested.
And he just gave the impression that, I mean, he became eventually, didn't he, Tony Blair's Minister for Blue Skies or something?
Yes.
And it was always cloudy. No, him and other people that came in, Peter... under Greg Dyke, who was brilliant for sport because he was on the board of Manchester United. He was a great football fan.
And Brentford, I think.
And Brentford, and he took over at Brentford. And he was terrific, but his appointments for sport were suspect. I mean, Peter Salmon didn't particularly. He came from light entertainment. He wasn't particularly interested in sport, or what sport he was interested in. He wanted to change to make it more razzmatazz and so on and so forth. And so Roger Mosey, who came from from news, equally, they didn't help us.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, your career clearly went through a sort of peak and then dropped away in terms of what the BBC was able to do. Did you feel unhappy when you left about the way that sport was?
Oh yeah, but very, very unhappy. I mean, in the interim, there had been, intervals where things had occurred that were, I mean, Princess Diana's funeral, for instance. I did 6 cameras on the route out of London for that, and a dreadfully sad occasion, but to be involved in something of that nature was a massive production.
Yes. Probably as big as the BBC could manage.
Then, certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly. But I was also directing things like stayed things, for instance, like the London Marathon, one of the base units at the Tower of London, which was always great fun. So we were always busy, but we didn't necessarily have the rights, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
That we'd lost rights to. But you made up for it. BBC Sport started really losing everything, going downhill in about 2000, and I didn't retire till 2006. Although there was a great World Cup, I'd been appointed with the Irish, with Jack Charlton and Maurice Setters in 1990 by the executive producer Jim Reside. He had given me this job of looking after the Irish in Sicily, and Jack Charlton made it plain that my job was to pick him up after he put the team to bed and take him to a bar that had Guinness. And then I did the same in Italy, and then I went to the States with Jack and Maurice. So that went on, that they didn't qualify for the next one. And then 2002, Mick McCarthy was manager, and I went to Dublin and met him there and with their organisers. And went to Korea and Japan. So that was 2002. That was great. 2004 was Athens, and then the World Cup in Germany was my last. And I did that. And but I was also doing Hickstead. I was doing eventing, badminton, horse trials, and so in 2006 I had to leave, but it was the right time.
Yeah.
I think it was probably a bit too late.
Yes.
For my own satisfaction in what I was doing. And then I started my own business and
you
carried on with basically equestrian sport.
Well, you may have gone through some pretty awful experiences in your sporting career at the BBC, but it looks as if on the whole you enjoyed it, and you enjoyed the company.
Yes, there were memorable experiences. There were University of Life experiences. There were times when I perhaps didn't perform to the standard that I later became aware of, what that standard was in the early days in particular. But overall, David, it was an absolute privilege.
Yeah.
If you enjoy sport,
Yeah,
10 World
absolutely.
Cups, 12 Olympic Games.
Yes.
Then I went to Beijing for the Olympic Broadcasting Service in 2008, looking after the football in Tianjin, where we only had an interpreter that spoke English, and the rest of the crew. Ted Ailing was the head of production out there, and he gave me this job with doing the football because of my experience in football in Tianjin, which was 2 hours drive from Beijing. And the cameraman, the direction was absolutely superb, and I didn't really have to get involved very much. But the interpreter kept coming in and to the office and saying, "Chris, we have a problem." And I kept saying, "No, we don't. We don't have a problem. We have a solution. What is it?"
Yes.
So this went on and on. On the day we finished, the night we finished, we were wrapping up. I was packing the papers up and so on in the office, and he came running in, and he said, "Chris, FIFA want to see you. We have a problem with FIFA." Now, you say the word FIFA, and I had to go and see them. This was...
Sure.
So, if it had been Mr. Blatter, perhaps I would have refused, but I went out, and he said they're out on the pitch. And I walked down the tunnel, and all the crew, Chinese crew, were standing in a line with their producer at the end, and he just came over with his plaque. And in Chinese, it's, "We don't have a problem, we have a solution." Throat wet.
That's great. And I presume you keep that.
Oh, indeed, it's up in my office along with
Yes.
my ego room.
Yes.
I got the job just about every year for Sports Review of the Year of going abroad to give the international prize or whatever to various sports personalities. And on this occasion, it was 97. Martin Hopkins was executive producer of Sports Review of the Year, as it was then, instead of Sports Personality. And Dave Gordon was the editor. And they wanted to get, I think Muhammad Ali was on the show, getting the special award. And they wanted to get boxers in.
Yeah.
And the world champion was, at the time, was Evander Holyfield. He was working for HBO boxing in Atlantic City, and the only way we could get him back was if I went and picked him up, got a car to JFK, stayed in a hotel and caught the 9:30 Concorde back to London, which would get us in time for him to get to the hotel, change, and be there for the 8 o'clock off. Anyway, I go and met by Mike Williams, his manager really, or gopher anyway, and Mike Williams took me up to his suite. Evander was, we were in Trump Towers. Evander was doing the boxing, which finished, supposed to finish at 11 that night. So I waited for him. And Mike Williams was called downstairs. He came back and he said, Evander, Holyfield, they never called him Evander, everybody called him Holyfield, is going to play baccarat with his mate Donald Trump. So I said, "Fine, do you know how long he'll play for?" And he said, "Well, it's up to him," and just shrugged. Anyway, the clock ticked over and ticked over. And eventually he came up to the room in a thunderous mood. Mike didn't even introduce me to him because he went into his bedroom and slammed the door. Mike followed him in, and apparently he'd lost $24,000. And he wasn't happy.
To Donald Trump?
No, to the casino.
Oh.
But he was playing with him. They were apparently good mates. So Mike came out and shut the door. After about 10 minutes, Holyfield came out again in a tracksuit. And so Mike thought he was going running, and he said, "Shall I come with you?" He said, "No, I'm going to win my money back." Went down to the table, And after, this is now 2 o'clock in the morning, and after about an hour and a half, Mike Williams comes through the door. I'm just sitting there and I'm beginning to think, this is the last time I'll do this job. I'm going to get the sack. And Mike Williams said, Chris, can you come down to the table? Donald Trump wants a word with you. So, well, what's that got to do with me? So, I went down to the table. I was introduced to Donald Trump by Mike Williams and didn't get a firm handshake. I got just one of those that you squirm at, you know?
You mean a limp? Rather a limp?
Yeah,
Yes,
and he did no eye contact at all. And he's staring at the table. He said, Holyfield and I want to play on. You can cancel your car. So I said, I'm sorry? He said, cancel the car in the hotel. You can have my private jet to go back to JFK in the morning. So what could I do? I went back to the room. I phoned Martin Hopkins.
Martin, yes.
Yeah. And with the time difference, it was just about all right. He'd just had breakfast. I cancelled the hotel. I cancelled the car. I sent the car. I went and saw the chauffeur, sent him all the... And I just sat there worried. Anyway, Evander Holyfield came up, much better mood, holding his tracksuit like this, walked over to the couch, and out dropped about $25,000 onto the couch. So he was happy. He'd won his money back. He said, I'm going to get some sleep. I didn't sleep, and there was only 3 hours. We had to get for the private jet, we had to get to the airport by 8:15. Anyway, I didn't sleep. He had about a couple of hours, and we went to the airport late. About 8:30 we took off, or we started a taxi, and there was one stewardess on board, and who was a stewardess plus an assistant or whatever. Very attractive, of course, working with Donald Trump. And so I said, look, I have a problem here. I want the ETA for JFK, and I need to get in touch with Concord Lounge. So she said, I can do that, sir. Came back with his phone and said, this is Toby, he's the steward in Concord Lounge. So this guy turned out to be an absolute diamond. And I said, Toby, my name's Chris Lewis, I'm with Evander Holyfield, the world heavyweight champion. He said, you what? I said, I'm with Holyfield, and we're going to be tight for time. You've never been asked this before. Could you hold up Concord for 5 to 10 minutes? He said, you're right, sir. We've never been here. And so I'm waiting, and I'm just so nervous by this time. And he came back and he said, I had a word with the captain, sir. He said, ask the passengers. Lots of them male business people. And he said, we got a lot of fight fans. It's going to cost him a lot of autographs, you know. So eventually we landed inside JFK.
Yes.
There was a car waiting. It was so well organised. Took us to the back fire escape, up the side of the building, straight into the Concord Lounge. And I met this guy called Toby, and all these guys are standing already waiting.
Yes.
Anyway, he signed all the autographs. And Toby's saying, right, we got aboard. Anyway, I'm walking out. I shook his hand and said, thank you very much, Toby. And he said, you're forgetting something. And I went, oh, silly me. So I put my hand in my pocket for the wad of dollars. And he said, no. What about my autograph? So Holyfield did a very special one for him. We got on board. My first time on Concorde. And I'd been looking forward to it so much.
Yes.
We got to Mach 1 and I passed out, and they woke me up approaching Heathrow. You think the story's over. Well, we got him to the St James Hotel. The programme was going out from the Queen Elizabeth II Hall in Westminster. And we're at the St James Hotel. And he goes to his room, and I said, fine, 7:30 we have to meet here. It's only a 2-minute drive to the Queen Elizabeth, but you'll get there plenty of time for the 8 o'clock off. And so 7:30 I'm waiting there. Mike Williams comes down, and I said, where is he? He said, he's put his suit in to be pressed, and it hasn't come back yet. I got the reception manager, and I said, can we go to the laundry, please? I need it.
Yes.
We grabbed his suit. I ran it up to his place, up to his room. By this time, I'm thinking, I'm going to deck this bloke. And that thought didn't last very long, obviously, because it's the world champion. But I thought, shall I bite his other ear off? Anyway, we get there. There's this guy, Charlie, who was the driver. Charlie Cars, worked for BBC, and a wonderful man is waiting there. We get in there. We get to the hall. Security's there. Chris White, the floor manager, is the other side of security. I push Evander Holyfield. He's already made sure. I push Holyfield, goes straight through to Chris White. I eventually go through security, go up to my seat, and I'm sitting right behind Alan Yentop. And it was just enough time to hear Des Lynam say, "Please welcome World Heavyweight Champion Evander Holyfield." And he walked out to this screaming applause, and I passed out and slept through the whole programme. End of story.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
So there were great happenings. Yeah. And then with the OBS, probably the peak of my career overall, not including BBC, but the peak of my career, well, including BBC, the peak of my career was being given producer of the equestrian at Greenwich for the home Olympic Games in 2012.
Ah, yes.
And that was probably the one to finish on, but why should I retire? I don't
Absolutely.
want to. So I went on and produced the equestrian in Rio, and then
as a freelancer,
and hopefully we'll get Paris.
Yes.
I'm not going to tell them I'll be 98 by then. But
Chris, that's terrific. Thank you so much for doing this.
Not at all. It's been a great pleasure, David.
Do you want to say anything about Les Dawson?
I thought we'd finished. Yeah,
and why? I mean, because that's about broadcasting in a sort of a bleak way.
Of course it is.
Why not?
What a gentleman.
Yes.
Never swore.
Is that so?
Never ever swore. His humour was just without. And if he did swear, it was for effect, in our conversations. But we were introduced by a friend. One of my best friends is a gentleman called Dennis Waterman, and and his then manager. I took leave from BBC to be Dennis's tour manager when the theme for Minder it got to number 2, I think, while we were on tour. But I managed him in Scotland and so on, him and Gerard Kenny and Sheen Reist. Anyway, the manager then, he knew Les Dawson, and he phoned me up after Dennis left to live with his future wife, Pat Maynard. John phoned up and he said, "Is your room free?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Les Dawson is doing blankety blank and he's looking for a place to stay on the weekends that he's recording." So I said, "Yeah, very, very welcome." And I was going up north, so I met him at his social club in Lytham St Anne's there, and he was a very social person. Everybody was worth a chat, and we played snooker. And anyway, he arrived and used to. This was a time when his wife was starting to get ill, and she had an appointment. She had an appointment to see a specialist in Manchester, and the surgeon phoned Les at our flat, my flat, and spoke to him and said, "I'm going to have to do a single mastectomy. You ought to come up because I want to do it immediately." And they got Megs in, and Les did the show and then travelled up. And when he arrived at the hospital, poor Megs was still under the anaesthetic, but was coming round gradually. When eventually she was compos mentis, Les, and she looked up and held his hand and said, "Oh, Les," and was very weepy. And Les said, "Megs," he said, "I've got some good news and I've got some bad news." And she said, "What's the bad news, Les?" And he said, "They've taken off your right tit." And she started to cry, of course. And she said, eventually, she said, "Oh, Les," she said, "what's the good news?" He said, "They've moved the left one to the middle." And she didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but that was the way that they were together, and that was the way of handling it. And
Well, I hope she laughed.
oh, she did, and well, he told me she did.
Yeah.
And then sadly she died, and she was such a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Would he use these? I mean, because he's great for one-liners, wasn't he? Mother-in-law jokes and what have you. Was he like that in real life, or was he?
Oh yes, and particularly, well, he phoned up one Friday and he said, "Can I stop?" And I said, "Yes, of course, Les. When are you coming?" He said, "Tomorrow." And I said, "How long are you stopping for?" He said, "About 3 months." So I said, "Fine." And he was doing the Richmond pantomime. I think this was 81.
Yes.
And he was doing the Richmond pantomime. And Rula Lenska was the prince, of course. And that's when Dennis met her.
Yeah.
And Les was doing the pantomime. Anyway, he came down, and you knew that he was... I knew that he was trying out a bit of material with me, you know, and if it affected me, if I laughed.
So if you laughed,
yeah. But his
give us some one-liners.
oh, he used to say, my mother-in-law was a redhead, no hair, just a redhead. He said she was a model, Toby jogs, door knockers, and oven globes. She. 2 teeth at the front. The only woman I know could eat an apple through a tennis racket. And every time she smiled, it looked as if her nose was playing the piano.
Oh, wonderful. And he'd try these out on you?
Oh, and it was just, I left there every morning to go to television centre with tears running down my face.
Yes.
Kensington House in those days.
Good.
But what was the last one? He said... I'm upset about my mother-in-law's funeral. He said, why? She's cancelled it.
Wonderful.
Oh, brilliant.
Chris, thank you so much for that.
Not
And
at
it's a lovely PS, and I think we might keep that in. I don't see why not. If you don't mind.
Not at all.
No, okay,
Not
great.
at all.
Well, thank you so much.